from the heart of Dubai, where tomorrow is being built today, to the world. Welcome to the CTO Show with Mehmet. Here, we redefine technology and reimagine possibilities. With Mehmet, delve into the riveting realms of AI, cybersecurity, and digital technology. Experience the thrilling highs and lows of startups. Immerse yourself in the spirit of entrepreneurship and witness the future of business innovation being written in real time. Now, without further ado, let's tune in and explore the future.
Hello and welcome back to a new episode of the CTO Show with Mehmet. Today, I'm very pleased to have with me from London, the UK, Nadia. Nadia, thank you very much for being on the show. The way I love to do it is I keep it to my guests to introduce themselves. So the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia. I'm epidemiologist by training. So my background span across sectors of government, academia, and now industry. And I worked across multiple diseases in real-world data and real-world evidence. And now I work at Holmusk and work in the field of psychiatry.
Great. Thank you again for being here with me today, Nadia. And, I'm feeling that people want to know about, the work you do. And, it's a tech show and we discuss different aspects, but I get excited every time we talk about something that touch health, right? So this is why, I got excited about today. And the first thing, I would love to ask you to give us an overview about the two things you just mentioned, which is like real world data and real world evidence. So if you can tell us a little bit about these two terms, an overview, and maybe later on you can explain how they are impacting the healthcare industry.
Absolutely. I love talking about real-world data and real-world evidence. So this is my prime time. Real-world data overall and evidence are data sources and any analysis streaming from that are generated outside of clinical trials. So these are all data generated, let's say, when you go to a doctor and you're not part of the clinical trial, but certain items of information get recorded. And sometimes they're used for, let's say, population level screening or population level statistics. Just a simple question about answering how many people do have cardiovascular diseases is impossible without these data, without real world data. So this is a key item that has been used for a very long time, but it has never entered really individual level statistics or trying to foresee what generate hypotheses or confirm hypotheses to such degree as it is now. And this is a field that has grown substantially in the last 10 to 15 years, primarily due to better recording of health data. Before, let's say 20 years ago, we had very broad statistics about health states and health risks and symptoms on populations. Now, with electronic health records or EHRs, we have far more. Now we can actually try and curate, cholesterol levels and how does that impact cardiovascular risk, or what kind of symptoms, let's say, a patient with schizophrenia presented to a hospital, and how does that impact their response to treatment. So it gives a lot more granularity, which is really important for us. And as we we have entered, I guess, the era of personalized medicine and the goal of personalized medicine, these aspects are incredibly important because we know that every patient is different. And there's actually a saying that I think was still from Hippocrates that it's much more important to know a person that has a disease than to know the disease and then go back. So obviously it's important to know both, but individuals differ a lot. And there are certain things that we need to know on a population level. Now, why overall this field is important is clinical trials are exceptionally important in establishing efficacy. And this is still the gold standard, and which I think will be for a while. But we don't know what happens to patients outside of clinical trials. Clinical trials are designed to select patients to eliminate any kind of confounding or any kind of reason that you think, right, this is probably a fact that is not due to the drug, but something else. So you don't want to have that ambiguity. But by default, they select very few patients. So a lot of patients, or most of the patients, never go into clinical trial, whatever the therapeutic area is. And by default, they don't get represented. So in schizophrenia, for example, that could be up to, 80% of patients are not eligible for clinical trials, which means we don't know how to treat those patients. And then response rates are not the same that we see in clinical trials, hence why it's really important. So it is adding a lot, real world data and evidence to the understanding of those patients' experiences, to the current knowledge. So it's not aiming to replace clinical trials by any means, but it's aiming to add more information about what happens outside of that setting and how do we sometimes better inform clinical trials.
That's great explanation, Nadia, and thank you for explaining that to us. Now, out of curiosity, because I spoke to a couple of executives who works with mainly companies that they focus on the clinical trials, and we know where the data comes from. Now, in your situation, like when we talk about real world data, real world evidence, now, like, are there like some, let's say, hospitals, clinics that enroll with these programs so you can collect these data? How does this work?
That's a very good question. And that's one of the more important questions is where do the data come from? Because that already shows what is the validity of these data items and to which degree we can use them. The most common setting for these data to come from healthcare provider is usually a hospital because or secondary care, more specialized care, because they
Hmm.
have a lot of data in-house. And that is mainly captured by electronic health records. So a while ago, mentioned 20 years ago, a lot of things were on paper. So there's not much of a trail that you can really pick up and turn into a patient trajectory. Now, with tech and electronic capture, we can actually follow up a patient in their presentation, diagnosis, follow up prognosis, etc. So that makes it possible. And it's usually most accurate, most well populated in a hospital setting.
Hmm.
Data can also come from primary care setting or let's say GPs that capture a bit more broader population, and it usually represents a setting where diseases are not serious enough to go to the hospital or they can be managed in a primary care setting. Recording of those information really varies within and between populations. Some countries or some healthcare providers have it very well recorded and some really don't. So it's a bit more uneven than, let's say, secondary care, but usually from hospitals. Now, when we say hospitals, we always assume, and this is true in a lot of therapeutic areas, that all of these data are generated by clinical personnel. So whoever assesses you puts in, let's say, suggested diagnosis, then it gets coded, but it's coming from a clinical staff assessment. In psychiatry specifically and some therapeutic areas, there is a lot of room for patient reported outcomes that were not that well captured a while ago. They're still not captured good enough, but they are becoming a very important aspect of how the patient feels. And that can stem from pain. How much pain does a patient feel? How do they perceive their quality of life? How can they engage in life? So patient reported is also something that gets sometimes captured in these systems. So clinically informed, patient reported outcomes, and sometimes there are surveys as well that combine the two, but most frequently a hospital.
Okay, that's great. Now you mentioned psychiatry, like, and you know, from the normal medicine point of view, I can understand, and you explained it at the beginning about, the again the trials and the way we do it. So maybe you have a disease, and then they start to do some experiments, and then they extract data and so on. But in psychiatry, like, what is the gap that actually you're trying to fill here? So what is missing, I would say, which you are trying to fix it out?
That's a great question. I think you already picked up on one of the most important gaps and the difficulties in psychiatry is that we don't have biomarkers. We just don't have, an equivalent, let's say, to measuring cholesterol or measuring a biomarker. And I'm not saying that it is very easy in other clinical areas or more physical diseases, but psychiatry lacks a lot of those just because we don't know. So it becomes a much more difficult entity to tackle. So one is just the lack of physical biomarkers that would be objective for us to judge the state. There are attempts, but they're not consistently used. And because of that subjectivity, it bleeds into the data that we work with. So a lot of the things we need to always consider the subjectivity at input, at source, and that it may or may not be completely true to reality. So say patient reported outcomes are very frequently used an example for a limitation that it is subjective. It is something that is not a biomarker, and that's across all therapeutic areas. But this is our in psychiatry, it's one of the most important information sources. So we have to bear the uncertainty of data recording, and we have to close the gap of just not having biomarkers. So we need to dig quite deep into data to have the closest comparator.
Great. This is very, I'm trying to think about it. Very useful, I would say, because by doing this, we can have, like, let's call it, more labels, and then this will help later on to get this. And the reason I'm trying to mention this after you, so for people to understand, like, because data nowadays is everything, and this is why you need uh, to have good classifications of the data. And I think this is very important part, especially in psychiatry, because it's like, as you said, it's very broad. It's not like you do, as you said, a blood test or something like this. Now, I'm interested to know, when we get this data. So I'm sure, like, there are, like, in the background, some engineering solutions that they play a pivotal role in managing this data. So can you give me some examples on how this data that comes, what happens next? Like, what are the things that can happen to start using this information?
I really love this question because this is a very commonly omitted aspect of real world data overall and use of it, because there's a lot of steps and there's a lot of plumbing, you can call, in getting these data into any kind of analysis. That is extensive work on governance, and that's very qualitative aspect, but also bears some quantitative metrics that we need to employ on data quality, on how do we use this data. A lot of data that we aim to use are de-identified, and that's a science and a work stream on its own, because we need to have good solutions that are scalable, that are effective to de-identify data. And the acceptance of error in this area is incredibly low. We cannot risk that. So you need to go so high in terms of your confidence that we can scalably and well de-identify data. That is taking a lot of tech solutions on its own. Then usually working with multiple healthcare providers, we need to standardize the data and pull into one big data set, which entails quite a few things. We need to work on the structure. We need to also work on the values, standardize those, make sure that we analyze each data set as part of a broader population. That takes a lot of finicky work, but is really important because our analyses are, because it's healthcare, we are very aware and we would like to avoid as much as possible any bias that we introduce in the analysis. And if there's an effect based on one healthcare center, then all of our analyses are valid. So we need to take great care into data preparation. And data engineering is probably one of the most important teams in real world data and real world evidence overall. It gets sometimes an unsung hero, I think. And there's a rule of thumb that 90% of the work is data prep and 10% of the work is the analysis. It's relatively easy to run a CNN or a regression analysis on a clean data set. It's very hard to get it to that point. So there are multiple steps: de-identification, which is a tech solution on its own. Then it's data management, data engineering, and then finally we go into analysis. So we have to have tools appropriate for each stage.
Yeah, and I know from not only in healthcare, like, the easiest part is the presentation of the data, at the end, but the hard works happen. So when I always tell people, when you see, like, these fancy graphs and these fancy interpretations of any kind of data, I say this is the top of the iceberg. Like, there's a lot of work that happens in the background, and data engineers, they work hard to clean this data, and by the way, it's funny, or nice to know, like, the methodologies are the same, but the verticals are different. So, for example, we're talking about healthcare, but it applies the same thing for any vertical. Now, because here you're dealing with, like, different type of data. So here we're dealing with maybe someone who wrote a note, about this patient, what the symptoms they saw. So I'm sure, like, and I'm going a little bit geeky here, I would say. I'm sure, like, you would be using a lot of natural language processing, NLP, to leverage this data. Am I right?
Oh, very much so. A lot. A lot of NLP in healthcare, and I have to say in psychiatry especially so, because going back to a few points that we mentioned, the data that we work with are highly subjective, but we don't have that many, lab tests that are really useful for psychiatry. So we do rely on clinical notes that can be semi-structured, unstructured completely to a very high degree. And that applies to symptoms, to the diagnosis itself, because sometimes it's not that well recorded in the coded domain, and we need to cross-reference that. So anything. And that relates to current experience, whatever patient is experiencing at this very moment, and also in terms of their history, because that's very important. When we consider their, let's say, response to treatment, we want to know what happened in the past, because that influences what happens after that. So we rely on NLP quite a bit. And the NLP approaches, of course, differ to high variety. Sometimes we use a very quick, you can do a regex on some of the data items that you need, and that would be satisfactory. And sometimes you need to go into a full model development that is quite laborious, computationally resource heavy and requiring, but that is the only way to extract the information, curate the information that we would need. So NLP plays a very significant role. And I have to say that I think this is one of the approaches that will be as prevalent as it is today, if not more.
Yeah. And the reason I asked this, just I like to explain sometime the reason I asked the question, because so people tend to think usually, and I'm targeting because I surprisingly, although it's a CTO show, I have people who are not from tech background, but they think computers, all that they do is like analyze the zeros and ones and the numbers. And the reason I asked about NLP, because natural language processing is what allows a computer to take something that we wrote or we said, maybe sometime you can transcribe this into something that the computer can analyze later on. And this will bring me to ask you, Nadia, about the buzzword AI. Like, what role AI plays in real world data and real world evidence? Like, how you leverage it for getting better results?
It's a very good question as well. I have to say the adoptance currently is patchy. We coming from, and I'm not a doctor for full disclosure, but from the medical part of community and working in medical sciences, we are skeptical to a very high degree, but also optimistic about the potential because there are so many things that we see could benefit from data capture. Patient being, let's say, or clinician examining a patient and recording the notes that can be automated to a high degree and extracting, let's say, key items at the source. There is high potential helping out with some of the more administrational tasks that play a significant role in healthcare because data recording versus what happens in practice could be slightly two different things. So that can be automated to a very high degree. And AI specifically can play a massive role because it would add not only the automation, but also the interpretation to a certain degree. Then we're talking about clinical decision support, which I think gets most of the hype and most of the promise from especially population. And I think a lot of people who watch healthcare and AI is hoping that AI will help to decide what to do with the patient's trajectory, what kind of drug to give, what is an optimal drug to give, what is an optimal dose. And that's a very difficult field. So we are very skeptical. Again, because the error, patience for error is very, very low. We can't risk it because at the end of the day, it is a patient and something goes wrong. That is a penalty that nobody wants to take, nor they should. So skeptical but optimistic. And then finally, we go into more in-depth treatment strategies, which I think are still a little bit in the future. In terms of to which degree it is adopted, now there are use cases. I can't say that it's a full AI independent mechanism, let's say, that is operating somewhere, or at least I'm not aware of that. There are good studies and good examples where AI in supporting clinicians, and that was a specific example in radiology, which is quite good, where imaging is being assessed,
Mhm.
that it improves outcomes in terms of assessing the diagnosis. So that was helpful, but it still has a person next to it. So currently, I think the realistic position of AI in healthcare is supporting the staff. In terms of replacing certain tasks, I think we are very risk averse. And you can see that AI and tech overall, adoptance in healthcare is much slower than in fintech or than in any other areas. We are a little bit slower because of the impact.
Yeah, 100%. But I believe, like with any other field, also in the market, as you mentioned, you gave some examples. Now in medicine, we like to say, let's take a second opinion. So maybe AI could be like a second opinion, or maybe first opinion, but the second opinion comes from a human. I see it honestly this way because, of course, we will not keep the AI fully to take decisions, especially around about our health, about our life, maybe. So uh, I'm optimistic on this because on previous episodes we discussed this, and we saw, how beneficial it could be, especially for example, uh, areas in the world that even they don't have proper healthcare coverage, for example. So this is what get me excited about that. But you mentioned something around how usually uh, the cycles of adoption in healthcare is different than other industries. So in your experience, like other than being skeptical, like what are other differences you can tell us about, especially in tech, for healthcare, and why, for example, adopting the technology that comes from a new startup is also like a challenge.
Yeah, there are a few. I think the most common ones and the most important implication is that availability of data is relatively unequal if we consider the broad tech. And I know I'm combining a lot of different industries versus healthcare. It's quite different. We don't have as much data, and we are very data greedy to make any kind of analysis to be inferential on applicable on a population level. So data availability is one aspect, and it will continue to be so realistically. There are certain developments. So say EHRs being available has massively increased the efficiency of healthcare analysis, and adopting more advanced techniques from ML now to AI. So there are movements, but it will be always difficult because, again, these are patient data, and that is under a very strict governance framework, which will continue to be so, if not become more strict. And that also differs between countries and even within countries. So data availability is one. The other aspect is that we deal with a lot of, well, probably a lot of industries could say that, a lot of messy data. We deal
Hmm.
with so much missing data, and we don't always know if it's missing or it's just not there and therefore not recorded. So can you say that a patient does not have any, arrhythmia if it wasn't recorded? And that's an
Hmm.
so we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, and using appropriate statistical analysis is quite difficult. So then you take an AI approach or take an ML approach, and you need to adapt it to your specific use case. So there's a lot of rework, which takes time. And let's say if we go into NLP and imaging analysis, where NLP at first was developed, not at first was developed, but best use cases are, let's say, if you give an image or and side by side text description. In medicine, there's a lot of weird ways of describing that image, because usually if you have, let's say, a chest x-ray, you would say no pleural effusion or none of these symptoms are there, which is difficult because you have an image, you have a text, and they are separate. Whereas in a traditional task, you would have, a picture of a cat, and that would be a description of a cat. So it's confirmatory. So it's a
Right.
very way of thinking in medicine that we see in the notes and in the data, and we need to adapt those. So missing data is one, availability of data is two, and then a very convoluted way of thinking and phrasing things in medicine.
Yeah, but do you think like these challenges will be overcame somehow in the future?
Oh, definitely. Especially the way of thinking and phrasing of the things. And that is developments, I think, over the last 5 years. Let's say NLP itself has done so much to overcome that. I'm actually very optimistic about that. Um, Availability of data, yes and no. We will have more data just by default, but I think it will always be a struggle and we will always be behind. Let's say fintech is my go-to example. Missing data, I think partially. There are some things that will be recorded better, but it always comes at a cost, at a unfortunately clinician, because we don't want to overburden clinical staff to record for the sake of recording. But again, we want to deploy AI, ML models. We want as much data as possible, but that's a tension point. So I think to some degree, yes, but methods for NLP and alike are certainly overcoming the problem.
Yeah, for the last point you mentioned about like causing an overburn for the clinicians. And this is because they need to do a lot of data entry, basically. And I believe AI can help here, in my opinion, right? So they can rely on this. I don't know, maybe with what we are seeing now, from the ability of AI algorithms to understand, the language, and even they can analyze the way we are saying something, also combining that with visuals. I believe, yeah, it will take time, definitely. And I know, by the way, like, there's a lot of labs around the globe that they are trying these things nowadays, and they are trying to build, actually, what's now known as large language models to get
Yes.
this data out of. Now, I want to come back to an area which is also important. Like, we touched base on it, which is mental health, right? So, what do you see challenges that can face real world data when it comes to mental health? I know we talked about psychiatry, but mental health is, like, it's something which is, I discussed on the show a lot, honestly, because a lot of people, especially in the past few years with the pandemic, with what's happening, closures and so on. So, how, what would be the challenges to apply real world data on mental health?
Fantastic question. We're considering this every single day, and that's the thing that we live and breathe. Um, Aside from the known challenges such as subjectivity of metrics, we don't know what to measure exactly, and it's not just us, but a lot of clinical community are also debating certain measures, like what does reflect you being well? Because it's a difficult question when you think about, are you happy? It's a almost, there are very few people who can very directly answer this question. It's almost always a philosophical question. Well, am I fully happy? So this is always a spectrum, and these are difficult questions to answer for us, let alone patients who have more important symptoms. So the subjectivity of that. One of the things I think is important to acknowledge is that, exactly to say, a lot of people struggle with mental health problems, and that is a massive spectrum. So you have broader population that has very different symptoms and a lot of comorbidity along the way. So even if we consider no hospitalization, so a patient is just having depressive thoughts and a lot of anxiety, these are already two different things. This is
Right.
already morbidity, and that is very difficult to tease apart. What is the difference? What do you treat first, or how do you treat first? What is the best approach to do that? And that goes into all the more severe diseases as well. It's very difficult to tease apart what is the cause, what is the main complaint, what is the main issue that is affecting patient's life, and what is the best treatment strategy for that. So there's a lot of chaos, and clinicians are doing the best that they can given the current developments. Um, so comorbidity is one. The fact that a lot of people struggle on different spectrum, I think, is two, because there's a lot of information. Um, I think one of the interesting things that probably is a bit more prevalent in healthcare is that we have data that are regulated. So, say data that we are working with are under very strict governance. There's a lot of data, especially pertaining to mental health, that is not regulated, and it's everything that you Google about yourself, or it goes into a lot of recordings. So that's an interesting balance between developed in a very strict framework and something that is developed in a more less regulated aspect. So we deal with two different sources of analytics and how they impact all of those. So let's say even NLP approaches that we spoke about, if you check publications in the last 3 years, a lot of those are on electronic health records, and there's a substantial amount that analyze popular social media entries as well.
Mhm.
So I think a challenge is to tease apart what is reliable, what is valid, where does the data come from, and how broadly we can apply this information to. Is it just limited to the study, or can we say something about a broader population? So if it worked for someone, does it work for a lot of people?
Yeah, so it's again the same story of the data reliability that you mentioned a few moments back. Now, Nadia, you have to deal with different stakeholders. So we talked about some clinicians, we talked about the data scientists and engineers. I think because of the governance part, so you need to talk to policymakers, any other stakeholders, and how do you manage? Like for me, like someone in your position should be kind of a product manager, because product managers they have to talk to engineers, they have to talk to sales, to marketing, to executives. So does it go for you?
Also, a very good question. It is sometimes challenging, but I think it's also one of the more interesting parts of the work that we do overall. And I'm epidemiologist, so I was always not a doctor, not a medical doctor, but I work very closely with clinical staff. And I'm also by no means a statistician, but I work with analytics. So you're always kind of in between and you try to draw the best examples, but you're never master of either. So a jack of all trades. That is the same case in what we do now. We have to work with healthcare providers and clinicians and also anyone else in that healthcare provider setting. So that can be from governance, from chief information officers, so a lot of different roles. Industry is, of course, a very different stakeholder. And the way to deal with this, I think, is to have a lot of empathy. And that's quite I think the only way, to be honest, to deal with this is to have a lot of empathy, is to imagine and try to understand where the people are coming from. So if we work with, let's say, a clinician, I need to really imagine what does it mean if I would ask him, like, can you just record these 5 new measures? We're just like, yeah, sure, that will take additional 10 hours of my day and that will sacrifice patient time. So trying to really understand and hear what people are saying, I think is the most useful thing. And same goes to the industry. They have a lot of pressures, variety of pressures. And the more we understand it, the better we can cater to all of them. And also balance probably different stakeholders because we never work in isolation. It's not only the industry that we are. So we have to make sure that you try to understand all of them and balance your approach as well. So a lot of empathy.
Yeah, I can see you need to be very patient and you need to be, uh, yeah, like it takes a lot of yeah, being patient. I would say, like like because you need to deal with different people, you need to have the ability because I told you like it's very similar to being a product manager, and I know some of my friends are, and they need to deal also with people who comes from different backgrounds. So the empathy that you mentioned, it's, it's
Yeah.
really. But I love these kinds of challenging roles. I would say because um, I believe they make the work exciting. I can see like you are very excited about this what you're doing, Nadia. So if I want to ask you, how do you see this field, the real world data evidence in healthcare, a couple of years from now?
I think a lot of the things that we are experimenting with now will either cement in their use. So let's say certain NLP approaches, certain tech solutions, certain methods that are highly reliant on available tech and data, I think will be further explored, and some of those will be used very commonly. I think there will certainly be new approaches that we're going to start experimenting with. So some things we're going to be satisfied with, some things are going to be new. And will it change completely? Will there be a breakthrough? I don't think so. I think one of the most appealing and difficult parts of working in healthcare analytics is that it is running a marathon. There's very few examples where all of a sudden something happens and then everything changes in clinical care. And I think this is where you mentioned patience. I think the most patience it takes is to sit with it and know that it will take years, which sounds quite hard, but it needs to be. Body of evidence is difficult to acquire and it takes a long time and multiple efforts. So it's one study will never, hopefully, will never be something that just changes healthcare. You need to have at least 30 things corroborating your findings. And this is just causality that we deal with a lot. So whether we'll be changed completely and drastically, probably no. Will we continue adopting things that are already developed in terms of AI and ML? Definitely. And I think you will see much better uses because a lot of people are doing that. So we will have more examples to learn from and also to develop. So I am very optimistic, I have to say. I wouldn't say quite optimistic. I am very optimistic because there's a lot of things that are untouched and I'm keen to see how they play out.
That's fantastic. I like optimism. I like optimistic people usually. I'm optimistic by nature. So I get excited also as well. And to your point, and because in the show, we focus not only on the technical aspects, or like, let's say, the detail behind the scene aspects of what we discuss. We give hints to founders or to be founders or entrepreneurs. And when it comes to healthcare, I always, my guest actually mentioned, and I would say I second this. You need to have not the in addition to patience, you need to have the perseverance, I would say, because
Right.
like you face a lot of obstacles. You have the policymakers who would say no, you cannot collect this data, and all this. So yeah, it looks to me, I'm not by any mean, I'm just a fanatic of healthcare tech. I can say anything that can enhance our lives, so this I get excited myself. Any like exciting project with what you are doing today with the Holmusk, Nadia?
Oh,
Anything coming?
quite a few. There are certain things that we have published already, and I would invite anyone interested in real world data and psychiatry certainly take a look. They outline some incredibly elegant approaches and to analyzing those data and to make an inference about a population. A lot of the conversation that we have is about severity at presentation. So this is very interesting in how it affects future risk. And I would certainly invite visiting our website and having a look. But there are quite a few coming, so definitely keep an eye out.
Sure. Nadia, I should have asked this before, like, but who are your customers? I would say, like, who you deal most with? Other, I mean, not for the clinicians. I mean, at the who use your product.
But by far, the biggest clientele is pharmaceutical companies. So we work very closely with a variety of different
Mhm.
sectors as well in different pipelines. And we work across different stages of their development as well. It's sometimes, let's say, phase two, more planning of the work and seeing how it benchmarks against what they have thought of their clinical development phases to be. And then we can also go into phase three and later points in describing population, seeing how it compares to the results that they had. So but certainly pharmaceutical companies are our main clientele.
Okay, got it. Where we can find more about your work and Home Mask?
Certainly visit holmusk.com where you can see a lot of publications and presentations of the work. And we do have high attendance and conferences, so we try to really disseminate the work that we do. I think they are quite fantastic curates. I am biased, of course. And for personal, you can always, of course, check my LinkedIn, and I try to share keep most exciting pieces of Holmusk there as well.
Great. As we come to the end, Nadia, I have to ask this. Is there anything that you thought that I should have asked you, or anything I missed? And you feel free also to mention.
It's a really good question. I think we covered it all, to be honest. I think we covered key things that are really important.
Oh, that's great. Some people, they think that this is a tricky question. It's not by any mean. So when I prepare, for the recording of the episode, I try to make sure that I covered everything we wanted to discuss about. But like, we are humans, we can do mistakes. I could have like jumped on anything. I'm telling people, no, this is not a tricky question. It's not like a kind of a getting rating for the shows. It's just for me to extract as much as possible useful information from my guests, because I learn also a lot. The audience, they learn a lot. Well, like, Nadia, thank you very much for your time, and especially people who works in your industry, the healthcare. I know how much busy they are, so thank you for taking the time for being on the show today. And I appreciate also all the information you shared with us. I will make sure that the links you mentioned are also in the show notes. And this is how we end the show usually. Thank you very much for everyone who tuned in today. Keep the feedbacks coming. I'm enjoying reading them. And also, if you have something you don't like or something you wish that I could do better, I would love to read these things. I love compliments, but I like also to see anything that you're not liking also as well, if there's any. And thank you for tuning in. We'll meet again very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hit that subscribe button, share the show with your tech-savvy friends and fellow entrepreneurs, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Your support means the world to us.